I am Dr. Crystal Downing. I am the co-director with my husband, Dr. David Downing of the Marion E. Wade Center. And I am delighted to welcome you here tonight for the 5th annual Ken and Jean Hansen Lectureship. It seems only appropriate to begin this evening with an invocation by Walter Hansen, the son of Ken and Jean, who along with his wonderful wife, Darlene, is here with us tonight, and they have made this lectureship possible. So Walter, if you could start us off.
So the evening is finally here. I've been in great suspense to figure out what in the world Matt Miller is going to do with this topic here. And maybe you've been in suspense as well. So I've been thinking, how in the world should I pray at the beginning of this? And looking up that, A Guide to Understanding, Insights. Paul says to the Philippians, I pray that your love will abound more and more in true knowledge and depth of insight. And I pair that with a favorite quote from Orthodoxy, G.K. Chesterton, love is not blind, love is bound. And the more it is bound, the less it is blind. Lord Jesus, we come as blind Bartimaeus came to you. Lord Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Open my eyes that I might see. We long to see you, Lord Jesus. We long to see others as you see others, so that we might, by your Spirit, love others as you love others, we ask. Amen.
Also very important to the Hansen Lectureship is our relationship with InterVarsity Press, which has published books based upon the first 3 sets of lectures. So we have invited our IVP editor, Dr. David Mcnutt, to share a few words with us tonight. David.
Thank you, Crystal. I won't take up too much time. I, like the rest of you, I think, am here with great anticipation to see where Matt is going with this. So I just briefly wanted to say a word of thanks for the relationship that we have at IVP Academic in particular, with the Wade Center around the Hansen Lectureship series. It's our pleasure to have published the first 3 volumes in that series. So I would just want to say a brief word of thanks and then a briefer advertisement. First to the Hansens, to Walter and Darlene. It has been a pleasure both professionally and personally to get to know you and to see your love for this institution and for the Wade Center and for your imagination and creativity to bring this entire series together. To Marge Mead and to the Downings for your care of the Wade Center and of the authors here who you so passionately support, and to the faculty members and respondents who have committed time in the archives, I know for sure, and also in preparation for these lectures. It's our privilege, as I said, to be able to publish these. 3 have been published thus far. It began with Dr. Phil Ryken's The Messiah Comes to Middle Earth, which was followed by Dr. Larson's George MacDonald in the Age of Miracles. And then the 3rd volume was Dr. Christine Cologne's Choosing Community, which she will be signing copies of tonight. This is the sort of launch for this volume. So all 3 volumes will be available for sale out here after the event. So just a word of thanks on behalf of IVP and our ongoing relationship. Watch this space next year. Be on the lookout for Jerry Root's lectures to be published on C.S. Lewis and Dimer. So thank you all very much. I hope you enjoy.
Also, the Wade is celebrating the launch of Dr. Cologne's book, along with the other books in the lectureship, by offering you a 20% discount tonight. So buy up all your Christmas gifts. We will then, after the introduction and the lecture and the response, there will be a reception as well as the book signing. And there is one more acknowledgement I want to make. These lectures would not be effective. In fact, they probably wouldn't exist if we didn't have this lovely space, the Bakke Auditorium. And we are privileged to have with us tonight Stan and Jeanette Bakke. If you could just raise your hands and just thank you. Now, I have the wonderful honor of introducing you to the speakers for this evening. Dr. Matthew Milliner, Associate Professor of Art History at Wheaton, where he earned his BA in 1998, which makes me feel very old, holds a PhD in art history from Princeton University, as well as an MDiv from the Theological Seminary at Princeton. And this places him in a perfect position to discuss the imbrication of art and faith that is so important to the Wade Center. We are especially delighted because he will engage one of the 7 authors who we archive here at the Wade, who doesn't get as much attention as others. G.K. Chesterton, whom both C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers identified as very important to their faith. Furthermore, this may be the first time that anyone has ever lectured in the Bakke Auditorium about the art and faith of Native Americans. How appropriate, then, that Matthew's respondent this evening has contributed articles for Native Peoples magazine and regularly reviews Native American films. A Wheaton alumnus, Captain David Iglesias holds a doctorate from the University of New Mexico School of Law and serves Wheaton College as Jean and Ede Floyd Kwame Associate Professor of Politics and Law, as well as Director of the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. In addition to writing about film, Captain Iglesias inspires film, having been part of the legal team dramatized in the 1982 movie A Few Good Men, starring Tom Cruise, Demi Moore, and Jack Nicholson. And according to Matt Milliner's website, which is delightfully called millinerd.com, Captain Iglesias is played by Tom Cruise. So, you are in for a treat tonight, especially because I consider Dr. Milliner to be one of the most superb lecturers I have heard since I moved to Chicagoland a year and a half ago. I had the privilege of hearing him talk about the history of Marion images at the church I attend. So, with no further ado, please welcome Dr. Milliner.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you. Ralph, we got room for you down here. Come on down. We got room. All right. If I started by thanking people for making these lectures possible, Walter and Darlene, the Downings, Jean Green, John Wilson, the Program in Global Learning, the Sabbatical Committee, the Anishinaabe, whose patience and permission has made this possible, we would be here all night. There are too many people to thank, and so I will spare you my endless thanks and just begin. Here is tonight's outline. That is taken on the way to Honey Rock, by the way. Just stood on the roof, took a picture. Okay. Toward the end of the 1900s, in a town called Haddonfield in southern New Jersey, a group of mostly white high school students heard the good news of the Christian gospel. God, we discovered in a top-floor recreation room filled with second-hand couches, was for us, not against us. I wasn't sure the friends I had managed to string together were for me, nor was I necessarily for them. I'm not even sure I was for myself. But Christ, we learned through this youth group attached to a mainline Methodist church, was for us. And the cosmos we inhabited, hitherto puzzling and possibly hostile, suddenly became hospitable and radiant. Thanks to intensive Bible study, the considerable gaps in my nominally Catholic understanding of Christianity were rectified in a matter of months. Haddonfield's Catholic Church and the adults of the Methodist Church to which our youth group was appended may have looked at the fervor of our youth group with some concern. We knew this, but we did not care. We feasted on the books and tapes on offer at the Good News Bible bookstore. We handed out tracts of the 4 spiritual laws on the Jersey Shore boardwalk and canvassed door to door for the 1992 Billy Graham Crusade in Philadelphia. Seeking a name for what happened to us, we learned somewhere along the way that it was called evangelicalism, but the name was not that important. And about 250 years before that youth group, in the same land, there was a similar series of conversions. These converts would not have understood the land as New Jersey, but Turtle Island. And they called themselves the Lenni Lenape, which means original people. And of course, in comparison to my ancestors, that is what they are. They were also called the Delaware, after an English politician, the 3rd Baron Delaware. The Lenape, or Delaware, also learned that God was for them. They were not sure the neighboring Haudenosaunee, a.k.a. the Iroquois, were for them, still less the colonists. But Christ, they learned through missionaries like David Brainerd, William Tennant, and David Zinzendorf, who defended them against settler encroachment, was for them. Some historians have a word for the successful tactics employed by these missionaries, and it is the same word used to describe my youth group: evangelicalism. The catechetical efforts of previous missionaries, insufficiently connected to Lenape life ways and thought, were rectified in a matter of months. Establishment Presbyterians looked at these missionaries and their new converts with suspicion. The Lenape knew this, but did not care. The cosmos they inhabited presided over the one they called the Master of Life, but by malevolent forces as well, became more hospitable and radiant. These Lenape did not need to become English in receiving Christianity any more than I needed to become Lenape. Now, Christianity for me meant considerable success. My new faith took me halfway across this continent, through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, where I was born, to a place called Wheaton College in Illinois. Nobody stopped me along the way. While at Wheaton, I went north to Wheaton's campus in the Wisconsin wilderness, where I sought God in solitary prayer. The beauty of this land hosted my newfound faith without hindrance or obstacle. I married a beautiful woman from Ontario and learned a new branch of this Great Lakes landscape. After a stint at ministry in Pennsylvania and more graduate school in New Jersey, I ended up back at Wheaton College, where I am today. Christianity has been good for me, but not so much for the Delaware converts. The Lenape conversion to evangelical Christianity did nothing to stem the tide of settlement. The Lenape had already learned that the sons of William Penn were not as kind as their father. Though they had made a covenant of friendship with William Penn, sealed with crosses, no less. You can still see it in Washington today. In 1737, the Lenape were deceived out of more land than they could have imagined, a land that I enjoyed as a playground for Christian ski retreats. In Easton, Pennsylvania, the same town where I intended a 1992 retreat to build up my newfound faith, the Delaware made a 1757 agreement with the English to cede more land, but the promises there made were broken as well. I drove happily and obliviously through Ohio on my way to college. The Moravian Lenape, converted by Protestants who traced their lineage back to Jan Hus, were pushed to Ohio, where they were caught between British and American military forces. In 1782, the Pennsylvania militia met them at their settlement known as Gnadenhutten, Tents of Grace. 160 American militiamen, falsely believing these Christian Indians had taken part in raids, voted to execute them. This was not the fever pitch of battle. They thought it over. The Christian Lenape, mostly women, children, and elderly men, requested the night for prayer, which was granted. And in the morning, 96 of them were, quote, beaten to death with mallets and hatchets and scalped as they sang Christian hymns. And what was left of them was buried in a mound reminiscent of the great Ohio native mounds from centuries before. As my white ancestors moved in, the Christian Delaware were pushed further out. At the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, they were deprived of their place in southern Ohio and moved to the White River in Indiana. Understandably, Christianity was growing less popular among the Lenape in these distressed times. Yet one Mohican convert among them, named Joshua, managed to hold on to his faith, even though 2 of his teenage daughters had been killed at the Gnadenhutten massacre. He wasn't there because he was being interrogated by the Americans. But whereas the white man had gone after his fellow Christian believers at Gnadenhutten, it was the Lenape themselves who came after Joshua. A series of Indian prophets arose that preached a gospel of racial separation. Demanding a return to native life ways, they sought to purge Delaware culture of Christian influence. After professing his faith in Christ, Joshua, along with several other Christian Indians, was killed and burned. Even then, many Christian Delaware held on to their faith, and their descendants, many of them, most of them, still proudly Christian, have taken up residence along the road that I had happily traveled on my way to Wisconsin. Another settlement of Christian Lenape diaspora barely survives in Ontario. My wife and I unknowingly passed it many times as we drove from Wheaton to visit her family home. I say it barely survives because in 1813, William Henry Harrison and his troops burned this Moravian Indian village to the ground, almost as if to suggest that America's beef with evangelical Indians was personal. I hope it's clear by now that my autobiographical comments are not an excuse for self-indulgence, but self-examination. The landscape from New Jersey through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Ontario, Oklahoma, and Kansas as well, where I have traveled for these lectures, is the dumping ground for any remaining Lenape Christians who managed to survive my country's attempt to destroy them. This does little to help me enjoy my comfortable home in Wheaton on Harrison Avenue, named after the general, of course. So what are we to make of this strange contrast between 2 receptions of the same Christian gospel? At least one thing seems clear to me, that there are more spirits at work on this continent than the Holy Spirit. If it was just Christianity at work in this landscape, then the Lenape and I and my ancestors would have received similar treatment, and our reception of the gospel in this land would have mirrored the vision of the New Testament, where all tongues, tribes, and nations are welcomed into the kingdom. As it happens, the conversion of these original peoples registered no change in their treatment at all. Other malevolent forces were at work. The Lenape and many other indigenous peoples intuited these dangerous powers, even painted them on caves, rock faces, and birch bark scrolls. And this lecture is just an attempt to suggest they were right. One might now fairly ask what any of this has to do with G.K. Chesterton. And the answer would be not much at all, and that's the problem. You see, throughout my education, I managed to hold on to my Christian faith with confidence largely through his ministrations. His orthodoxy was inoculation against theological liberalism while I was a youth minister at a mainline church and later at a mainline seminary. While in graduate school for art history, Chesterton's bold and sweeping outline of time in The Everlasting Man was an antidote to the secular disposition of my university. I read it with relish on one of my many funded trips to the Mediterranean, where Chesterton told me I must go to experience the things themselves, not just the European or American reflections of those things. I learned from Chesterton that ancient rock paintings could be interpreted not reductively, but as evidence that humans were made in the image of God. I learned from him that medieval legends were not to be discarded, but delighted in, that the Renaissance was Christian to the core. His intuitions on all these points have, in my estimation, only been confirmed. When the celebrity atheist philosopher Slavoj Žižek came to my graduate school and cited Chesterton approvingly, my love for the Prince of Paradox was vindicated. But what remains is to apply his insights to this continent that he visited so briefly. Chesterton was a localist. He loved his England, but I don't live there. Maybe the best way to honor his legacy is not to discuss what he did, but to do what he did to this time and place. To say the same things about this continent that Chesterton said about England, France, Greece, and Italy. The stakes on this question was raised one recent evening in Oxford. I was there with Wheaton students. Eddie was among them, and he's here with us today. And after enjoying our required C.S. Lewis tour of the city, my family and I made our way with those students to the Eagle and Child, which once hosted the Inklings who would have discussed Chesterton at length. We opened the door to see a bunch of Americans like ourselves seeking the same experience, staring back at us, and we retired to the cafe next door for a cheaper and less crowded meal. And we discussed with Lily Huang, a Chinese-American student, whether or not Chesterton fairly grasped Asia. I'm not sure he did. At that meal, we concluded the obvious, that the Oxford of the Inklings was not our Oxford. After all, just one block away, at the Ashmolean, we had seen a glorious display of a prized Native American artifact, Powhatan's mantle, given to the British by the man who was Pocahontas' father, newly on display since 2017. They want to talk about us, this continent. We had also passed the Pitt Rivers Museum, which I would learn later that summer still retains the family treasures of a Christian Haida woman I met who wants them back. What would the Inklings, what would the authors that we collect here at the Wade Center have said about that? In short, is the Wade sufficiently woke? And any of you who think we could dismiss these authors with that question might hear a lion growling in the distance. Many years ago in that world, says Aslan to Prince Caspian, a shipload of pirates was driven by storm on an island. And there they did as pirates would, killed the natives. Caspian, who is a descendant of those very pirates, is horrified by what his ancestors did. I was wishing that I came of a more honorable lineage, he tells Aslan. You come from the Lord Adam and the Lady Eve, Aslan replies. And that is both honor enough to erect the head of the poorest beggar and shame enough to bow the shoulders of the greatest emperor on earth. Be content. What would it be like to look at Indigenous issues that way, not paralyzed by guilt, but still sobered by appropriate shame? I'm convinced Chesterton, who's the everlasting man, was instrumental in converting C.S. Lewis, can help. In his book, The Crimes of England, Chesterton derided his native land for their treatment of the Irish, lambasting those who think the empire's actions were somehow defensible. Permit me, however, to quote him while replacing England with America and Irish with Indian. The truth about America is simply this, that the relations between America and the Indians are the relations between two men who have to travel together, one of whom tried to stab the other at the last stopping place or to poison the other at the last inn. Conversation may be courteous, but it will be occasionally forced. But sometimes such modifications are not even necessary. Chesterton complains that Charles Dickens, quote, sees nothing in the Red Indian except that he is a barbaric, retrograde, bellicose, uncleanly, and superstitious person. In short, that he is not a member of the special civilization of Birmingham or Brighton, end quote. And after Chesterton's extensive travels in America, he perceived a profound lack in his analysis. I wish I had more time here to do justice to the Red Indians, he said. That is what I aim to work toward here. Blaming Chesterton for not using our more sensitive terminology to describe the First Nations is like complaining that a horse and carriage is ill-equipped with airbags. Native American culture was not visible when he traveled here because my ancestors suppressed it. But we are living through a Turtle Island renaissance of that culture now. You're living through it. Instead of bewailing the limits of Chesterton's richly Christian vision of history, I hope to extend it. What would it look like to read The Everlasting Man, Chesterton's theological outline of history, with this continent in mind? When ancient cave paintings were first discovered in Europe, some used them to dismiss Christian understandings of human ancestry. Chesterton reversed this conclusion. Far from threatening a biblical perspective, these ancient cave paintings confirmed it, offering what we might call an equivalent to the Big Bang Theory in terms of human consciousness. Evidence that humans are made in the image of an image-making God. And if rock art is evidence for human uniqueness, then recently published evidence for such paintings in the Midwest should be at least as exciting as the discoveries to which Chesterton responded. As we try to make sense of the ambitious paintings and carvings in Missouri, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, Chesterton, who revels in the mystery of human creative ability without too quickly trying to decipher a meaning, continues to be relevant. Quote, "The historian must take these paintings for granted," he tells us. "It is not his business as a historian to explain it." Interestingly, Lakota holy men say the same thing about Midwestern rock art. Unexplainable things belong only to Takuwaken, holy mystery, they tell us regarding the images. Black Elk, rebuking the white man's curiosity, simply says, it is a mystery, but one that we can still reverently explore. This interpretive convergence regarding rock art is not surprising, considering both Chesterton and Black Elk were faithful Catholics, and both are on the path to sainthood. There are even passages where Chesterton expressly tells us that when it comes to native myths and legends, go to natives first. Quote, "When the professor is told, on the best Red Indian authority, that a primitive hero carried the sun and moon and stars in a box, unless he clasps his hands and almost kicks his legs as a child would at such a charming fancy, he knows nothing about the matter." Yes, I wish Chesterton did not use the term Red Indian in that sentence, but his fundamental insight is correct. And when newer scholarship leaps toward reductive meanings, telling us that rock art, quote, derives from the structure and electrochemical functioning nervous systems regarding a shaman's social dominance, Chesterton's hand clasping and leg kicking are to be preferred. Fortunately, some recent scholarship on American rock painting is keen to avail itself of indigenous wisdom to complement archaeological acumen. Still, I wonder, how far will we go in trusting Chesterton's red authority? Chesterton wrote about how pre-Christian European mythology was a search fulfilled in Christianity, and the search had to be honored. Christians have long credited the pagan poet Virgil in his fourth eclogue with prophesying Christ. In Chesterton's day, that was becoming very unfashionable, but he defended that interpretation. Quote, Virgil stands for all that saner heathenism that had overthrown the insane heathenism of human sacrifice. Even the very tone and incidental diction of the great poet Virgil, that we feel their potential sympathy with the great event, that is the incarnation. Now, this is a positive view of the ostensibly heathen world that anticipated Christ. Virgil, for Chesterton, stands for all of that saner heathenism. But did we have Virgil's as well? When petroglyphs were first cataloged on this continent, it was nearly irresistible for researchers to mock missionaries for perceiving in them a foreshadowing of Christianity. What some ministers presumed to be primitive crosses were, in fact, just dragonflies, one researcher assured us. But to suggest prophecies to be impossible, moreover, is not just to undermine white ministers, everybody loves to do that, but it's to mock natives themselves. For in practically every corner of North America, one can find tribal stories anticipating the white man's coming. One Hopi prophecy tells us that the forefathers had long predicted European arrival. The white man, quote, will come either with a strong faith and righteous religion, which the Great Spirit has also given him, or he will come after he has abandoned that great life plan and followed to a faith of his own personal ideas, which he invented before coming here, end quote. Easy, one might say, for Hopi to retroactively invent a prophecy to explain what happened to them. But the exact same thing happened in Illinois. In Black Hawk's autobiography, he mentioned his great-grandfather's dream of the coming of the whites. He prepared for the encounter for 4 years with fasting, went out to meet the explorers. The Ojibwa artist Norval Morrisseau reports what a nearly 100-year-old woman told his grandfather, claiming that when the Hudson Bay Company appeared, the people recognized the unusual fabrics from the visions that foretold their arrival. Chief Joseph Riverwind has recently claimed that the entire Sundance ritual is itself a prophecy of the crucifixion, which it turns out is actually a rather common observation in indigenous Christian communities. One Acuma Pueblo prophecy even states that, quote, the gray eyes are going to get you to drink black, hot water, which you will drink wherever you eat. Even tea and coffee was foretold. Please understand, I am not trying to say that every indigenous pre-European contact cross amounts to a prophecy that rises to the level of what Chesterton said about Virgil. This cross, surrounded by plumed serpents found in Oklahoma dating to 1300, is just indigenous shorthand for the underworld. But I am saying that some pre-contact crosses do rise to the level of prophecy. In 1605, 15 years before Plymouth Rock, the Mi'kmaq, in what is now Nova Scotia, embraced Europeans in part because they bore the cross they were waiting for. It is reported matter-of-factly in secular Canadian anthropology textbooks. Quote, one of the main reasons why the Mi'kmaq became followers of Christianity, says a Mi'kmaq woman named Eva, is because of the vision of the 3 crosses. They saw 2, the 3rd was brought. Pre-contact petroglyphs testify to this, which are famous enough to be adopted in the Mi'kmaq chief's insignia. Again, perhaps this was all invented retroactively. But what lends these accounts authenticity is that news that the cross came before the missionaries is on record as a point of annoyance for the missionaries. The 18th century French Recollect priest Father Christian Leclerc found it rather frustrating when he was told that the cross was prophesied by Mi'kmaq ancestors not brought by him. Whether this is definitive evidence that the Mi'kmaq foresaw the Christian cross could maybe still be debated. What is not debatable is that the Mi'kmaq embrace it today as an act of continuity with their ancient history, evidencing a Virgilian compatibility of Christianity with indigenous thought. Chesterton claimed that for pre-Christian Europeans, it was an act of piety to forget God. Pagan gods and goddesses may have abounded, but the supreme God for the Romans was discreetly beyond view. And in the same way, ethnographers on this continent tell us the early Ojibwa did not organize a cult around a supreme being. Kichimanitu, the great spirit, played no role in traditional Ojibwa myths, did not appear in visions, did not speak in the shaking tent ceremonies. They expected no aid from a God so great as surely to be unconcerned about humans. And this is confirmed at Teaching Rock, the largest cache of Canadian rock art, quote unquote, discovered in 1954 and dating between 900 and 1400 AD, which is to say before contact with Europeans. 900 separate glyphs made over time so that stylistic development can here be observed. And I'm showing you a map deliberately, not showing you photographs, which the Ojibwa stewards of Teaching Rock discourage. And what puzzles researchers is that the rule to not depict the Great Spirit may here have been broken by the sun figure. Quote, available ethno-historic literature confirms that this glyph is either a representation of Kichimanitu, the Great Spirit itself, in its manifestation as the sun, or else a depiction of the most powerful of shamans, the prophets who have received their power from the sun, end quote. The Ojibwe Midewiwin scroll tells us the Great Spirit is said to be invisible in form, and yet they may have dared to make the Great Spirit human here. Perhaps we see a possible anticipation of hope that God could become human. A white light, as of a lost morning, still lingers on the figures of Jupiter or Pan or the elder Apollo, says Chesterton. And that's a mosaic of Christ disguised as Apollo beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Maybe Teaching Rock is our North American equivalent. And interestingly enough, when the Ojibwa converted, they did feel that now the Supreme Being, and not just the Manitou, heard their prayers. This is an admittedly speculative connection to Christianity, as speculative as the suggestion that Virgil prophesied Christ. But other anticipations of Christianity are a matter of record, even if those records have been deliberately concealed. A standard prophecy of European arrival circulated in the family of the Lakota holy man Nicholas Black Elk. But when the same Black Elk told the white author John Neidhart that in a vision he saw a mysterious figure that was neither white nor Indian, Neidhart conveniently left out the part where the figure had holes in the palms of his hands. Perhaps this Lakota holy man seeing Jesus would have made Black Elk seem insufficiently exotic for a white audience. As is well known, Black Elk would be swept up into the movement we know as the Ghost Dance, which was lambasted by missionaries as a pagan revival. But what is less well known is that new research on the Ghost Dance confirms a view of it as a revival indeed, but a Christian one. There was a reason why participants in the Ghost Dance sought baptism. There was a reason why it was reserved for Sundays. And it wasn't only Black Elk, but Kicking Bear, who also had a vision of Jesus during this revival. Another record survives of a vision of an indigenous woman who fell during the Ghost Dance, whereupon, quote, an eagle hovered over her, picking her up and carrying her to a house. The door being open, the eagle went in first and she followed and saw Christ and shook hand with him 3 times and said he was glad to see her as she had been there before, end quote. At the end of the day, Chesterton's appeal to Virgil as a prophet of Christ is still speculative, while the case for our North American Virgils is on comparatively solid ground. Virgil saw through a glass darkly. The Lakota saw Christ face to face. Still, just as Chesterton's view of European paganism was not entirely positive, neither should our view of Native American spirituality. In attempting to reconcile Lakota and Christian wisdom, there were features of indigenous religion that Black Elk had to repudiate, specifically its violence. Black Elk also had a vision that instructed him to use the bad medicine of soldier weed to wipe out his enemies, men, women, and children. And so he, quote, refused to take responsibility for such wholesale destruction. He gave it all up and became Catholic. This is Raymond Damalley's research. Still, when the actual soldiers of the 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment, massacred nearly 300 Indians associated with the ghost dance at Wounded Knee Creek, more than half of whom were women and children, they used precisely the methods that Black Elk, in the name of Jesus, had renounced. Amidst all the ink spilled regarding the blood spilled at Wounded Knee, we need to say one more thing about it, namely that we had an indigenous Christian movement on this continent. And like those Lenape Christians, we killed them. Or perhaps a better way of putting it is that we swallowed them whole. As it happens, I think native rock art gives us an image that will help us hold that uncomfortable truth in our minds. Preeminent among the rock art is the underwater panther, the piasa, the mishipeshu, described much less felicitously by some researchers as the BWS, the beneath world spirit. These images can be found at Agawa Rock on Lake Superior, or in Picture Cave, Missouri, or in modern survivals in Wisconsin and Illinois. They are interpreted in a variety of ways, but rarely are these beings good. Most native traditions say they caused harm. Most scholars insist they must be interpreted dynamically, allegorically, symbolically, which I aim here to do. Mishipeshu is not a generic category of beast, as if we could find them in the zoo. According to one native elder, they were not created by the Holy Spirit. Often they represented death. One recent scholar even connects white dismissals of these lake monsters as a tactic to both flaunt our superior scientific knowledge and dislodge native connections to lands they sought to conquer. And now, the relegation of these monsters to the quirky annals of weird U.S. or Midwestern strange, charming as such regional pride might be, may perpetuate that condescension. Chesterton got this. Quote, if we have called the first sun, the first sort of benign mythology, the daydream, says Chesterton, we might very well call the second sort of mythology the nightmare. But I don't just want to connect that nightmare with aspects of native culture, but with my own. Because for the original inhabitants of this land, the nightmare was us. Indeed, in initial contact with Native Americans, there are reports that they considered us underwater beings. And those reports may have been partly accurate. Morisot tells us that the Mishipeshu stole babies. Do underwater panthers really steal babies? We might be tempted to ask. If we see the removal of native children torn from their families by the American and Canadian governments as the Mishipeshu in action, the answer is a definite yes. Chesterton viewed horned serpents triumphantly as an image for indestructible Catholicism. Quote, its horns and tiaras were like the horns of crests of antediluvian creatures. But I'm choosing to see this monster as something much less benign, applying another of Chesterton's insights. Quote, human Christianity in its recurrent weakness was something too often wedded to the powers of the world, end quote. Now, modern researchers were not the first to see these images. In 1673, as Father Jacques Marquette canoed the Mississippi River in what is now Alton, Illinois, he encountered considerable testimony to the artistic richness of the inhabitants of the land he was exploring. The originals are lost, but a recent copy made by local residents of what it might have looked like can be seen on the site today. Marquette describes the images he saw painted on a bluff in his journal. Quote, "Good painters in France would find it difficult to paint so well." I am not now going to be so facile as to suggest that when Marquette looked upon that image, he was looking at his own racism. We're going to need to be a little more subtle than that. Those who wish to tell off this Jesuit missionary for his Eurocentrism should at least have the decency to do so in at least one of the 5 native languages that he mastered. By most accounts, Father Marquette was a magnificent missionary. As one recent scholar suggests, Marquette spent the majority of his narrative describing not how he took possession of the Illinois, but rather how the Illinois ceremoniously took possession of him. One scholar even argues that the entire Jesuit mission in what is now Illinois was an attempt to escape the colonial policy of forcing natives to first become European. These were the Jesuits who are on record weeping in relief, not when the natives became French, but when they worshiped Christ in their own way, namely by sprinkling powdered tobacco over a crucifix. Like the Moravians among the Lenape, the Illini Indians of this area received the new message with joy. But the Mishipeshu was hovering. And when Marquette witnessed it, he saw an image of what was to be. A few decades later, not far from the site of the painted Mississippi bluffs, things looked much different. In 1699, at what remains of the great pre-Columbian civilization of Cahokia, 2 ways of being Christian clashed. Marc Bergier, a priest of the Seminary of Foreign Missions, attempted to steal the Illini language dictionary from the possession of the Jesuit priest Julien Bineteau. The incident escalated into an international controversy. It was even discussed at the court of Versailles. The new strategy of Frenchifying was quickly eclipsing efforts to create Christianity on the Illinois' own terms, which is to say that France, through the person of Bergier, had finally caught up with this potentially indigenous church. Eventually, even the Jesuits would abandon their earlier strategy. Over a century later, in 1819, in what is now the United States, a massive swath of what was previously French territory was under the supervision of a single French Catholic bishop, Benedict Joseph Flaget. It looks like an Anglican diocese in Wheaton, it's so big. Okay. A refugee from the French Revolution, Flaget oversaw an impossibly large diocese centered in Bardesville, Kentucky, that comprised 10 American states. Flaget had read stories of Jesuit encounters with natives, accounts that, in light of the reality of life on the frontier, were now described by some as sugar-coated traps. The possibility of realizing indigenous forms of Christian faith was replaced by tending a disparate flock and defending the legitimacy of Catholicism to Protestants. Flaget's encounters with any remaining Native Americans who had survived the military campaigns directed against them were sparse and frequently negative. Flaget even made a nostalgic trip to the grave of Father Marquette overlooking Lake Michigan. He was despondent, faced with, quote, the discrepancy between the image of a great missionary past with its cradle in the Great Lakes and Mississippi Valley and its interest in the salvation of the Indians and the development of a national church, end quote. And 2 years later, in 1821, nearly 800 Delaware Indians were forced to leave the White River in what is called the First Trail of Tears. This experiment in forced removal was then elevated to a national policy. The tract of land underneath our feet here was ceded in 1829 at the Second Treaty of Prairie du Chien. And the very next year, when resistance to President Andrew Jackson, much of it from Christians, failed, the Indian Removal Act was passed. Jackson's life was saved in battle by a Cherokee. That didn't matter. The Seneca and Sandusky and even more Delaware were forced out in 1831 and 32. The Ottawa in 1837 and 1839. And by 1838, the American government had lost patience with the Midwestern Potawatomi in this area who would not leave. This tribe had arbitrated between white settlers and the Sauk during the Black Hawk War. They were peacemakers. And many of them had also, like the Delaware and the Illini, become Christian. But neither of these facts would help them. Remaining Potawatomi, who had not sold their land, were surprised, rounded up by a militia under General John Tipton, whose dad had been killed by a Cherokee when he was only 7. He was hurting too. Tipton's militia marched over 800 Christian Potawatomi out of their land, which they had not sold, to make it ours. Known as the Trail of Death, this is only the most famous of dozens of removals, clearing the place for Wheaton College. The Trail of Death was like a Gnadenhutten, hymn singing mingled with death, extended over miles and months. Picture the scene as the band of them gathered at Quincy on the Mississippi, not terribly far from where Marquette saw the painting of the Mishipeshu. They gathered for Mass at the Catholic Church. They interacted with the local population who wished them well, had a little Protestant-Catholic debate, right? And then they were all loaded onto barges. Painter George Winter's sketches of these Indians leave no ambiguity about the nature of their faith. Again, if it was just Christianity at work in this landscape, then the Lenape, the Mohican, and the Ghost Dancers, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, all of them Christian, would have received similar treatment to white Christians. As it happens, their conversion registered no change at all. They preached moving sermons before and during their expulsions, sermons that survived, but it doesn't matter. Again, because there were more forces at work on this continent than the Christian gospel. Quote, "Two powerful and mighty spirits or gods are standing and opening wide their jaws toward each other to swallow." End quote. These are the words of the one-dot headman half-king told to the Moravian Christians at Gnadenhutten before they were killed. That is not pagan superstition. It is a prophetic and poetic description of brute fact. If Mishipeshu dwell deep underwater, they can dwell deep within the process of settlement as well, perhaps still unknowingly influencing us. So call these images what you will: Satan, racism, colonialism, the shape-shifting ghost of white supremacy, as one author puts it, or the chaos of human evil. But whatever you call it, don't think you're completely free from its influence. That point was made with unexpected force to me at a recent visit to another modern appearance of the Mishipeshu called the Hodag, the city mascot of Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Another quirky chapter in the Midwestern regionalism currently undergoing another revival. This creature was invented by the prankster and marketing genius Eugene Shepard to draw people to his town, which has taken up this monster as their mascot. When my family visited the Museum of Hodag Paraphernalia, the tour guide showed full awareness that the Hodag could be traced back to Native American legends, even if it was now just a fun ghost story. The guide concluded with a friendly word to my children: "Hodags are real. Tell your friends." I'm not sure if this is how he intended it, but I'm taking him up on his counsel. And I'm telling you, my friends, with the unsettling history of American settlement in mind, that these creatures exist. The only kind of Midwestern regionalism that interests me is a penitent regionalism. Quote, "Moloch is not a myth," or at any rate, his meal was not a myth, Chesterton tells us. And neither was this nation's systematic killing of Indians, many, probably most of them Christians. Hodags are real. Tell your friends. My people will sleep for 100 years. But when they awake, it will be the artists who give them their spirit back. These are the words of another Virgil of sorts, the Métis statesman and martyr Louis Riel, and his prophecy is coming to light in our time. It's hard to say exactly when the Renaissance, the rebirth of native art on this continent, began. Might have been when the Canadian anthropologist Selwyn Dewdney, who painstakingly cataloged the rock art in our region, found himself with Jim Red Sky, an Ojibwe shaman, uncovering the secrets of the birch bark scrolls. Now, Dewdney noticed something strange on the wall, a plaque with proof of this man's proud membership in his local Presbyterian church. How could he, writes Dewdney, accept, let alone be nominated for, an eldership in the Presbyterian church? But what puzzled Dewdney, and what continues to puzzle and frustrate many in the art establishment, is a matter of fact for so many indigenous persons who continue to choose Christianity for themselves. And if you have eyes for it, you will see that the Moravian Lenape, they dance in powwows today at Cape Croker, and those powwows reflect the ghost dance. And the Oklahoma Lenape, they have reasserted their Christian faith and their seal right next to their art, kind of reminiscent. Some of the art here at the Wade Center. If you have eyes for it, you'll notice that in Nova Scotia, Christian Mi'kmaq scholars continue the theological conversation that has been going on there for 400 years. As I was researching these lectures, Harney Peak, where our Virgil had his vision of Christ, once named after an American general who butchered the Lakota, was officially renamed Black Elk Peak. Rushmore, that's for tourists. Christian pilgrims should make their way to Black Elk Peak where Christ appeared. Christianity has died many times and risen again, remarks Chesterton, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave. And so it goes with this continent as well. There are at least two errors about racism circulating in our society right now. One is that it has been permanently defeated, and the other is that it is omnipotent. By using the symbol of the Mishipeshu, I have tried to counter the first error, but to conclude, I want to counter the second. We need to remember that in indigenous mythology, the Mishipeshu had a natural enemy, namely the thunderbird, which can be found all over the Midwest as well. You will see one such petroglyph on your way to Honey Rock, the only publicly accessible indigenous rock art in the state. And it is this motif that many native Christians have taken up as their own. When the Ojibwa Methodist minister Sacred Feathers, a.k.a. Peter Jones, converted to Christianity, he aligned himself with the thunderbird, which can be seen in the oldest surviving photograph of any indigenous North American. That same sacred bag, that one right there, lovingly made by an anonymous indigenous woman, is still on view at the Metropolitan Museum of Art today. These sacred Ojibwa artifacts that enhanced Protestant liturgical celebrations are relegated to a back room in St. Paul, Minnesota's Science Museum, alongside dismissive plaques. What do they show us? That means holy mystery. What do they show us? That native converts identified with the thunderbird. More recently, the followers of the great Ojibwa painter Norval Morrisseau, resisting what the art world demands of them, have identified Christ with the thunderbird as well. And what you are seeing here is not just the contest between the thunderbird and the serpent, but the victory of Christ over the serpent in Blake de Bossaget's Tree of Life. that responsibly fuses Midewiwin lore with the Christian faith. This is an accurate map of the Mississippian Cosmos, the worldview of this very land before European contact. Notice the thunderbirds. Notice the serpents. Notice the axis mundi, the sacred tree. De Bossaget's cross makes evident what some white scholars cannot stomach, but what indigenous Christians have long known to be true. The gospel established, confirmed, and fulfilled the 1,000-year-old metaphysical insights of the land we now call the Midwest. No wonder the Mishipeshu wanted Christian Indians to be destroyed, and it used my ancestors to do it. The woman was given 2 wings of the great eagle that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. The dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and bear testimony to Jesus. Revelation 12. I want to suggest that with each of these instances of the Christian thunderbird, the hodag is challenged again. Secular Canadian opponents of Christianity like to challenge Christians to read the Truth and Reconciliation Report that catalogs the horrible things done to the First Nations, often under Christian auspices. But when you actually take up that challenge, as so few people do, you will read this from a Presbyterian minister, quote, "Can the Reverend Margaret Mullen, thundering eagle woman, from the Bear clan be a strong Anishinaabe woman and a Christian simultaneously?" Yes, I can. She has taken up the Thunderbird in the name of Christian ministry as well. And right here in Chicago at the Kateri Center, that we'll be hearing more about in the next lecture, the cross-crested Thunderbird adorns the altar. Chesterton concludes the everlasting man in this way. He says that the boys of the world have been happiest under Christendom, that fixed flash of instant and intolerant enlightenment, the lightning made eternal as the light. When I first read it, I agreed with it too glibly. It's more difficult to read that now, knowing what my country did to the original residents, the boys and girls of this continent. As someone who has directly benefited from that subjugation, I can only agree with Chesterton, and I do agree with him. I can only agree with Chesterton by insisting that this great flash of Christian lightning must include Christ the Thunderbird, who makes indigenous suffering his own, and who still threatens to incinerate our serpents wherever they are cleverly concealed. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for coming. So, it's the first time I've heard you lecture. I like the fire. You're going to get ice for the next 10 minutes. But I want to talk to you about a topic called From Buzzard Island to Turtle Island, a Kuna response to Dr. Matt Milliner. My friend and colleague Matt Milliner spoke movingly and wrote movingly of Turtle Island. The nautical theme is appropriate since I lived for nearly 7 years on an island off the Caribbean coast of Panama called Buzzard Island, or Mulatupu in the Kuna language. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. And I want to take just a few minutes of your time to talk about art, Indigenous Americans, missions, warfare, G.K. Chesterton, in the brief time that I have. But first, let me introduce my tribe, the Kuna Nation, who have a long history of successfully resisting Western encroachment. We are one of the most independent tribes in all the Americas, and for my brothers and sisters in the North, there are other Americas that some of us have visited, some of us are from. Time will not allow me to explain why my tribe is one of the most independent, other than to say it involves a Christian missionary woman named Anna Coop from the early 1900s, my family, the English language, an American adventurer named Richard Marsh with friends in the U.S. Congress, and the construction of the Panama Canal all played a role in this special status. Kunas live in approximately 50 islands in an archipelago consisting of about 365 islands. It's on the northern coast of Panama along near the Colombian border. It's on the Caribbean. It's the southernmost point of the Spanish Main for you Pirates of the Caribbean fans. And most of the islands are about the size of the typical American shopping mall. So if you've been to Oak Brook, that's about the size of the typical island in Cunayala. And a lot of the islands contain anywhere from a few dozen to a couple of thousand people. Now, Kunas are studied by Western scholars like Dr. Milliner for a couple of reasons. First, the women wear a beautifully sewn reverse applique blouse called a mola. In my opinion, they're wearable art. What does reverse applique mean? I'm really not sure, but I'll show you an example. These are all hand-stitched in the Congress Hall every night. The women are sitting around the edge. The men are in the center on hammocks conducting business in Kuna. The women are stitching these, both for personal wear and to sell to the tourist. And these molas depict nature, abstract designs, and even biblical themes. So you might ask, why do Kuna women make molas? I ask my Northern American artist brothers and sisters, why do you make art? They are beautiful interpretations of life. And the Kuna women want to wear something beautiful. I entitled part of this response, Yer Dailige, which means they are beautiful. These are beautiful pieces of art that you can wear or you can mount on your walls or even make pillows out of them. Who are the Kuna? Well, we call ourselves the Golden People, which should tell you a lot about our self-image. We're a group indigenous to Panama and Colombia. Some live on the island, some in the rainforest, and some in the cities of Panama. English pirate Lionel Wafer wrote the first book about the Kuna in the 17th century. He called it A New Voyage and Description of the Isthmus of Panama. And that title is correct. That's not a typo. He was a doctor and a pirate. Some of my friends would say they're both the same thing. So Wafer was injured, spent 4 months with my tribe in 1695, and he wrote a book about his experiences with the tribe. He talked about body painting, nose rings, and he actually wrote a short Kuna dictionary. Anytime I see a young American with a nose ring, I think, are you my cousin? So Wafer left the practice of medicine to become a buccaneer. And he wanted to sack Panama City, which had a lot of stolen Inca gold. But he was injured, and my tribe nursed him back to health. So here we have a trained medical doctor intent on sacking a rich Spanish city. Truth is indeed stranger than fiction. Western scholars have also studied Kuna governance because every night there is a highly meeting in the evening, and every facet of island life is covered, including disputes, including how to price the sale of coconuts. Anything that can be mediated, consider this to be a combination of Congress and small claims court, rolled up into one. And my father used to spend hours every night talking to the chiefs. So the Kunas are the golden people. They're the artistic people. But I think the best name that I have read is what a professor of anthropology at MIT called them, which was a people who would not kneel. And that is a topic that Dr. Milliner spoke powerfully about. In the North, the tribes were forced to kneel. In the case of my tribe, we were not forced to kneel for reasons I can't get into due to time. But despite 500 years of contact, and I do note that Columbus's fourth journey to the New World, he mentions meeting a group of people which I believe to be the Kuna in April of 1502. So that was a very, very early after European contact. But the Kuna survived guns, germs, steel, warfare, piracy, encroachment, and have survived on their own terms. And according to James Howe and my own family's oral history, my family was active in tribal politics, and I knew you came here to avoid politics. But I have to talk about it because it is inescapable in this story. So about 100 years ago, my oldest uncle Claudio received his education from a Jesuit, Padre Gasso. Went to Costa Rica, came back, and he became what scholars call a radical modernist. Now, what does that mean, a radical modernist? Well, my uncle Claudio believed that the Kuna should embrace Western culture, turn its back on tribal customs such as wearing nose rings, wearing the mola, to become westernized. My uncle Claudio was on the wrong side of history, I'm sad to say. He was pro-Panamanian, anti-tradition, and those views did not sit well with tribal leadership because my uncle was killed by traditional tribal members. My father was named Claudio. It was named in honor of the oldest brother, and that is my middle name. My oldest daughter is named Claudia. So that's a name that resonates in my family. So this collision between West and Indigenous led to a violent and successful revolution in 1925 and led to an autonomous status of the Kuna and a grudging respect by the civil authorities in Panama City. My next family member who became educated was my uncle Lonnie, who went to the U.S., received his college education, married a woman from Michigan, and came back as a Christian missionary to his own people. So if any of you have heard K.P. Yohanan talk about Native missionaries, I mean, my family was doing that 80 years ago. So this is not a new idea. He knew the language, he knew the culture, and he was the oldest surviving of 11 children. So extended family. He also became, I'm going to talk about politics again. I just want to warn you. He became a member of the Panamanian legislature, where he helped draft legislation to protect Kuna independence and territorial integrity. So my family was doing Native missionary work in the 1930s when the common model at the time was Western missionary to Native people. That model was impossible on the islands because my tribe banned foreigners spending the night on the islands, especially men, for obvious reasons. An exception was made for my American aunt and my American mother. The New Testament was translated by my family and hymns translated by another Kuna couple. And a people who would not kneel to earthly powers learned to kneel to the God of Israel. It was this type of independence which is typically Kuna Let me give you a more modern example. We all remember when President Carter entered into a treaty and gave the Panama Canal back to Panama. It had to be approved by the people of Panama, and it overwhelmingly passed except for one region. Kuna. Kuna wanted to stay in American control. Why? Well, because the Kunas worked on American military bases. They sent money home. They trusted the United States in a way that they did not trust Panama City. So when you think about that, your mind kind of bends because of the history of the American government in the North. And at least as regards to my tribe, completely different experience. But my Uncle Lonnie experienced personally the transformative effects of the gospel and of Western education. He convinced his parents to send the youngest sibling, my father, Claudio, to America for education. And, you know, a lot of times we talk about immigration and we come here for the land of opportunity, but if you talk to my father when he was alive, he would say, I didn't want to go. I was happy living on the islands, going to the jungle, fishing, but I had to receive an education, so I was forced to do that. So he ended up, after going through Ellis Island, which was still open in 1936, went to a Baptist-run orphanage in Muskogee, Oklahoma, where he grew up with Native Americans from the North. He became the second Kuna to receive a college education, married my mother, Margaret Geiger, from Minnesota, Wheaton class of 1945, and they went back to the islands as missionaries for 15 years. Now, my mother was a Wycliffe Bible translator to the Mazateco tribe in southern Mexico. So missionaries, indigenous, politics, the military all collide in my family history. But they decided to come to America to allow my sisters and I to receive an American education. We moved to Oklahoma, the land of the red men, and then New Mexico, where my parents led Native American churches in Gallup and Santa Fe and Albuquerque. We became friends with a large number of tribes, including Delawares. I remember meeting Delawares and Osages and tribes you've never heard of because they were all dumped in Oklahoma. I learned how to say God in Kiowa. I learned to sing the Creek Hallelujah. We were immersed in North American tribal culture. And my father was treated with open arms, even though his ancestry was from the Central and South America. It didn't matter. And we went to powwows to visit and show our support to church members. Powwows were, am I pushing the right button here? Left and right. Can you advance it one, please? I think we have a hot dog in here. I have a great slide of a powwow. What I remember about powwows is this. You can hear it. It goes right through the core of your being. It's an overwhelming experience, regardless of your own ancestry. For somebody of an indigenous ancestry, it is an overwhelming experience. To see this color, the sound, the chants, the counter chants, the swirling. I mean, it is a overwhelming experience. And the hair on the back of my neck is standing up just thinking about the drums and the chanting. It's really powerful. And I hadn't seen so many indigenous people since leaving the island, so it kind of blew my mind, to be honest with you. And then I came to Wheaton in 1976, and I would be a unicorn. And there's no indigenous equivalent of unicorn. It's a great Western concept, but I was the only overtly indigenous person here. But I did find a tribe. That tribe was Wheaton football. And I had the long hair, which was culturally appropriate for both my tribal culture and my athletic culture. And then I made lifelong friends. It was just a wonderful experience. But I ended up going back to New Mexico. I went back to the familiar world of Hispanic Native, and Anglo. And I could not have foreseen a return to the tribal world until I became United States Attorney with jurisdiction to enforce federal law on tribal land. So Uncle Sam loves Native peoples, but he doesn't trust them to have their own criminal justice system. So the Justice Department enforces 10 major crimes. So I saw the beauty of Native life in the North and South. I saw the danger, I saw the crime occur, and God gave me just the perfect background to meet tribal leaders and prosecute criminals and help make Indian country a little bit safer. And Indian country is actually the term of art used in the federal court system. But it wasn't until I came back to Wheaton 5 years ago that I was able to take my daughters back to where I was raised, Buzzard Island, Mulatupu. And you can see they're wearing molas, and you can probably spot which are my daughters. Kunas are not very tall, but there is fire in their veins. And then I also had a chance to take a study program to South America, and I met 2 out of the 3 political leaders of my tribe. My students met them, asked them a lot of interesting questions. I think Noah was there. And I just love this picture because it's like a Mount Rushmore or something, you know. And then I got to go back. Thank you, Wheaton College. In 2016 and 2019, I took my football tribe to meet my real tribe, where we rebuilt a church that was created in 1930 and fell apart. So talk about concentric circles of life directed by the Holy Spirit. My life came full circle, Sandblast Islands, Wheaton College football. So where does art come into this picture? Well, art to me is more than just beauty. It's a testament that a people live. The Kuna would see art as a living, breathing phenomenon that they can use on a blouse, a nose ring, a wood carving. If you remember one thing about my comments tonight, please make it this. We survived, we persisted, we live. And if you're ever in Panama, you'll see Kuna women in full regalia, like this, wearing scarves. And this is a beautiful testimony to the persistence. So I'll close my comments by quoting Chesterton, who said, "Art, like morality, consists of drawing the line somewhere." So where is the line to be drawn? I'll show you. On the nose. The Kunas love long noses. Any of you with long noses would be welcome on the islands. We have a Kuna woman painting a black line down the nose of a Wheaton football player who wanted to have that done. My daughters did the same thing. I didn't. But there you have it. In 15 minutes or less, Indigenous resistance, art, missions, warfare, and drawing the line. Thank you very much.
We will take a 3-minute break to arrange chairs so that we can have a question and answer time with our 2 speakers from this evening, and this will be your chance to participate in the conversation. We appreciate if you could wait and ask your question when you have the mic, because we record the question and answer time as well. So we'll move the chairs and get going with your opportunity to engage.
Could you all take your seats? We're going to have a little bit of question and answer. And I'm Dr. David Downing, the other co-director with Crystal, and I would like to give them, first I'm going to give Dr. Milliner a chance to respond to Dr. Iglesias. Anything about his remarks that you would like to reply to?
You know, I sometimes, as I'm writing this, I'm like, ooh, I know this is going to be hard to hear. And it might be hard to hear when I say that the land is cleared for Indians for Wheaton College. And I was like, Wheaton can take it. Wheaton can take it. Because then you hear a story like that. And we can go really hard with the criticism because we love this place and it will rebound and God uses things. I remember going up to Manitoulin Island trying to get as far away from Wheaton as possible. There I was doing indigenous research, and the place I stayed at, they're like, oh yeah, my daughter went to Wheaton, so glad you're here. I'm like, you can't get away from this place. So, and speaking of which, we did late breaking news here. There was an exhibition of Mola art at the Billy Graham Center not long ago. Did you see this?
I didn't, but I heard about it.
Come on, there we go. So, constantly reinventing itself, this beautiful place.
Okay. Questions from the audience? Wait for the mic so we can get it on the recording.
And I've got one of these, so you can use this. Yeah, I got one of those. There we go.
Oh, it's going to be hard.
Not for him, it's not. So thank you so much, Dr. Milliner. I want to hear more what you mean by a renaissance. Is that something happening internally, or is it like a discovery from the outside, or is it some of both? How long has it been going on? What is it contrasting from in the past? Yeah.
I mean that the reason I chose that term particularly is because when we think of Renaissance, we think of the Italian word rinascita, a rebirth. It's translated into French, but it's used by Italians. What are these Italians doing? They're trying to steal the thunder from France. And so they came up with a derisive term, Gothic, to make fun of their architecture. And they said, well, France doesn't have something to go back to. We do. They looked down and they said the Greco-Roman culture is being reborn in our time. That's exactly what's going on here right now. We have something down there. It's been completely inhibited. Nathaniel Hawthorne begins the Golden Fawn by saying, oh, America, how can you write great poetry in a land without ruins? Well, we have ruins. We're so good at erasing them. And so we are as lucky as 15th century Italians. We don't have to fantasize about living at that time. We are going through It wasn't just Black Elk Peak that was renamed in the course of this lecture. I'm driving through Minnesota, and there's another lake, new name. We're switching, because we want to go back to the original wisdom of this continent. And in that rebirth, Christianity doesn't get the attention that it deserves. It was the same with the Renaissance. Burckhardt, son of a pastor, Nietzschean, comes along and gives us the myth of the secular Renaissance. Chesterton beats down that myth and says, no, it's Christian. The best scholarship backs him up now. In the same way, we're living through an indigenous Renaissance. People use it to attack Christianity, but in fact, it's a pretty incredible endorsement of this faith of ours. Thank you.
Yeah, can I just add something to that? So if any of you want to go to the oldest continuously inhabited parts of the United States, where would you go? Some of you think, well, maybe Fort Augustine, maybe Santa Fe. No, go to Acoma Pueblo, Sky City. It's 1,000 years old. People still live there. Wow. Taos Pueblo, north of Santa Fe, 1,000 years old. So we don't know this because we don't study that in school. But having been to those places several times, they're really special places. And again, I hate to dip into politics, but it's in my blood. James Comey, the former FBI director, when he was the Deputy Attorney General, I took him to Sky City. And he went to the edge. It's on a 300-foot mesa. And he looked out in this enormous green, red sandstone valley, and he just stared. His staff had a hard time getting him down. I said, Jim, what are you looking at? He goes, I've never seen anything like this. I feel like I'm on a different planet. So please visit, okay?
Yeah. Wow. I said to Captain Iglesias after his response, I said, I knew there was something missing about this lecture. There was something. And then when I heard his response, I knew what it was. The complexity of the United States as well, right? That in some cases there was an endorsement and a support of Native culture. That was the case. But I just felt like in regard to this particular area, this is the story that I wasn't told. So I think there was such an important complement going on there.
Who would have thought history become
Hey, what do you know? What do you know?
Thank you for your lecture. I was just processing, because of my Guatemalan background, of the Maya.
Right.
And you're seeing an indigenous renaissance up and down the Americas, actually, of reclaiming. But it's also getting commercialized.
Yeah, it is.
So now you do Mayan tours, and then it also gets politicized. In Guatemala, it's been to the European Union, which funds a lot of this stuff, but they want it to go in a particular direction, which is kind of what you're talking about too. They want to recreate the Maya as they want the Maya to have been. Which is what you're talking about too. So how do you keep this from getting commercialized? And in the commercialization, in a sense, it gets neutered, because now you can just look at it and take pictures, and now you're kind of woke. Right.
Exactly.
So how would you
buy
tell?
Buy some trinkets.
Yeah, buy some trinkets, or take the. Take the college tour and have someone talk to you, and now you're all guilty, and you go back, and which is okay. That's helpful. But I mean, how do you move this into a constructive piece?
Yeah.
Just kind of a wandering question.
If I can quickly share the most egregious example of this that I'm aware of, and this is material I didn't have time to include, but Norval Morrisseau, who I showed you, I was born for a purpose. Jesus called me to paint. When he said those words after being saved by Jesus from a hotel fire, when he's in prison, they're keeping this drunk Indian safe, and he says, "Give me my paintbrushes, I want to paint the Lord." I want you to imagine Jackson Pollock, the art dealer, not the painter, the Canadian art dealer, saying, "Oh no, those aren't going to sell." The whole reason that this project began is because a friend of Denise and mine has a Norval Morrisseau, household name in the United States. How could she afford a Morrisseau? Christian, price goes down. And when Morrisseau is taken from the North Ojibwe, brought down into Toronto, becomes a big deal, has that vision, this is what they did. They shared with him Eckankar. And this is a New Age religion invented by some Minnesota white guy in 1965, believes in reincarnation and spirituality. They told Morrisseau about Eckankar, and then his painting started to sell. He started to experiment with everything sexual under the sun. He left his indigenous Christianity behind because that was marketable. And you go to Ottawa today, the Eckankar-inspired paintings are the ones that the politicians want to have their pictures in front of, not the Christian ones. And that is not my critique. That is an indigenous Canadian critique of what they did to Norval Morrisseau, the worst example of that I know of. What's interesting about Christian Native American art, the stuff that I had to find, that is dug up in forgotten dissertations. It's hard to find this stuff. You start to talk about Jesus in your paintings, tourists aren't interested. So Jesus, in some senses, can preserve us from certain commercialization. But I'd be interested in your take on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the alternative to at least getting exposed to other tribes like the Maya is to just not. And I'm not sure that's a good response. At least learn something, I think, is valuable. And I think some of the money does go to the tribal people. I mean, my own tribe is dealing with that right now because there are a lot of uninhabited islands that you could build resorts on. So some of the Kuna are starting to do that. So they're getting people coming in for a week at a time, getting their Instagram photos and flying home and leaving a lot of garbage, I mean, literally leaving garbage to be picked up. Gosh. So is that ultimately good for the tribe? It's good for the individuals who own the islands because it's quite lucrative. But does that lead to cultural degradation? Probably yes. So I don't think the tribe has completely figured that out yet.
Wow. Professor Barba.
Thank you for a great lecture and response. My heart was strangely warmed as I heard so many references to Methodism, and
that joke was strangely reheated just now. That's right. No, I'm joking.
It won't be the last time, I assure you. I'm reminded of Wesley going to Savannah and asking himself, sort of, I came to save the native people, but who will save me? And having that real conflict of understanding of his own faith. As I was listening, I was reminded of, I formerly worked in Oklahoma, and when I would teach on American Christianity, I would have a friend of mine who was a native person come to class and share his own faith and how he brought together his tribal traditions and his faith. And I remember students often in shock, struggling to figure out how these come together, the cultural differences, and it was truly cultural. So if I can ask you now, having seen you approach this art, what strategies would you give us as we look at art that you say, we can see something here? I wonder on a very practical level, and so much of your lecture hit this, what should we do as strategies to understand this better? In other words, beyond the reaction, what strategy should we employ?
Same kind of thing. I have been, like Wesley, you go there thinking you're going to give something, and that dies pretty quickly. And I'm getting everything from this. And the biggest breakthrough happened, we had big thunderstorms around here not too long ago, a couple of days ago, in fact. And I had tried to put my head into the Indigenous Cosmos that beautiful map illustrates, and live in that world. And what if the underwater serpent is down there, the serpents are down there, and then they connected Scorpio, that constellation, to the underwater serpent. So sometimes he would go up and threaten. Okay? Now what happens? They believe in the day is really good, right? But the night, what's going to go on? It's Akhenaten felt the same way, and Lewis sees a slight trace of dualism in the great Egyptian pharaoh, monotheistic pharaoh's view. He's like, it's not fully Jewish yet. And so I'm living in that world, trying to imagine it, while still being Christian, of course. And then the thunderstorm, and I'm driving along, it's like daytime, but it's at night. And it just, that you look up into that world with that wonder. And that's when the end of Chesterton's book, right, the eternal lightning, the lightning that never goes away. That's what Christ offers. Hence the Thunderbird for them was like, of course. And so when they're stitching that bandolier bag and connecting Jesus to the Thunderbird, that is so much bigger than my perspective as a Westerner who tries, oh, right, yeah, you believe in the thunder. No, it really is a world that you can inhabit. And the art is, in some senses, an access point to this. I was saying to wonderful colleagues in philosophy, it's like, hey, we teach Plato and Aristotle without problem at Wheaton. We walk into a pagan temple. We call it Edmund Chapel. It's in a pagan Greco-Roman style. We have no problem with that, you know. And I say, so why don't we assign certain books like native books in our 101 philosophies? And I have to admit that maybe some of that native philosophy might not rise to the level, but the art certainly does. So the art, in some sense, is the first gateway. And we deemed them sub-Western and sub-literate because they might not have trafficked in our kind of verbal discourse. But the art, if you see that as the carrier of their wider epistemology, their cosmos might actually rival and surpass ours. And that cosmos has been Christianized as well. So glad you pointed that out.
Let me just make one comment about the spiritual side of things. My father, in the 1950s, went to a formerly Baptist university called Redlands in Southern California, and he was given a hard time by a sociology professor about why he was a Christian, why my father, being indigenous, was a Christian. And my dad's answer, he's preached this in a lot of sermons, he said, because you don't understand in the West, you don't believe in the spirit world.
Right.
We live in the spirit world. Kunas are terrified at nighttime of all the spirits. Christ takes that fear away. So he just bottom lined it and said, you know, you don't get it. I am a believer in Jesus because he takes the fear away, because he is stronger than the evil spirits that inhabit this world.
Oh, and this gets kind of scary because you're like, man, you know, we believe in negative spirits, right? We live in a world where that's a possibility. And if they're like, all right, well, kind of, I'm losing some control with this native world because this Jesus is coming in. Ooh, those white people, I'm going to use their forces. And I feel like that's kind of what happened. But the great trick happened because we stopped believing in those forces. We were therefore all the more malleable. And I still think that world is the real world. And if we stop believing it as Christians, you have the Menninger Foundation who's writing psychological studies where they're coming up with language to explain what's happening to their patients, and they can't get help from Christians, so they're almost approximating our Christian understanding of the world that we've abandoned. So interesting to think about. Malevolent, disembodied psychic entities exist. And Jesus is more powerful than all of them.
Can I ask, how does pre-Christian imagery such as crosses relate to saving knowledge? When a missionary encountered this kind of a culture, what work would they feel they needed to do?
The three cross prophecy, the two crosses that they found weren't enough. Eva, that indigenous Mi'kmaq woman would say, we needed to find out all the details from you who brought the message. There's a wonderful prophecy that Richard Twist tells in his wonderful book, One Church, Many Tribes, that in the Pacific Northwest of this country, there was a prophecy that people will come with leaves between their hands. And when they came, oh, there you are, you're finally here. And that was the Bible, right? And that I remember reading those and being like, okay, I want that to be true, but give me the data here. Show me the footnotes. And the more I chased it down, the more I found, I was like, it wasn't just that story. There was story after story after story. And so Virgil's not enough. Two crosses is not enough. Intuitions are not enough. You have to have that fulfilled. The sun dance, where you are tethered to a pole, piercing yourself in certain Lakota practices, is intended, like the sacrificial system of the Old Covenant, to be fulfilled in Christ. Does that mean you give it up completely? You can still do it with Christ in mind. But that fulfillment is kind of the F word in some of this indigenous Christian relations. Don't say that, there can be parallel tracks. But I still feel like I've talked with enough wise indigenous Christians who are comfortable with fulfillment. But the problem is after the fulfillment, there was this unique European way of being Christian that was used to beat down all these other examples. That's the rub.
Yeah, I just want to add, so there was some controversy in Native churches around the powwow movement, because initially Christians who were Native did not want to go. Not because of the actual celebration, but because of the after powwow events that typically involved a lot of drinking and a lot of fighting and a lot of bad things that go along with that. But my father realized, you can go to a powwow and go home. You don't have to. You don't have to stick around for the after party. And he really made a lot of friends because his lack of judging them for just going and celebrating the culture and dancing. Let me just say this about the Oklahoma Indians. They're fascinating because the most militaristic tribes, the Kiowas, the Comanches, the Apaches, there are a lot of Christians in those tribes. They were incredibly violent, not just against the Mexican army and the U.S. Army, but against each other. But once they got saved, they became soldiers for Christ.
Wow.
So just it always really kind of blew my mind when I saw the high numbers of Oklahoma tribal members from those tribes in my dad's church. Wow. I mean, you expect that from the sedentary tribes, from the potato cookers, right? From the farmers. You don't expect that from the warriors, but the warriors, in many cases, the strongest Christians.
And that's what's funny. You go to a powwow sometimes and you bring along some people, I hate America, what we did to Indians. America's so awful. It's like, well, you better get ready to stand for the veterans for the next 50 minutes, right? And yes, Vietnam vets especially will be honored. And it's like, welcome to the complexity of the warrior culture, that they're honored. And the prayers often begin in the name of Jesus, and I love that. It also frustrates people,
Are you able to trace, is there research, yours and others, that traces the prophecies back to previous prophecies, back to the two cross, let's say?
Yeah.
Where does that come from? It arises de
okay.
novo out of nowhere, or is there something before that? And to add to the complexity of the question in my mind is,
Sure.
Trace it back in previous prophecies and theologically reflecting on that, where does that come from?
This is what Bishop Stephen Charleston, an Alaskan indigenous bishop of Alaska, in his book, The Four Vision Quests of Jesus, simply calls the Old Covenant of Native America. He says, think of it in that fashion. Just as Isaiah saw dimly that a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, that they had that same gifting through their culture. Now, I'm with you, Walter, in the sense that I'm like, to what extent is this just some, I want it to be true and therefore I'm going to put it together. And that's for me, hunting that down, I found the petroglyphs with the crosses on it in Nova Scotia. I visited them. So you get to see this. You're like, okay, now, do we know that they definitely predated contact? Some of the Mi'kmaq will say yes. But when I saw that missionary angry in an 18th century account, I'm like, okay, we got something here. Still, is it as much of a smoking gun as Old Testament prophecies? Maybe not, but I was surprised by what kept coming back to me. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Yeah, I'm not doubting that it was pre-Christian Western influence. I mean, I'm accepting the evidence there. It is more a question trying to trace that back. Once you say it was there before pre-Christian, is there any possibility of tracing it back to previous Native American prophecies?
Yeah.
And then along with that, you think of John 1:9, he is the one who enlightens everyone coming to this world. And I begin to think of a whole number of other biblical texts like that would assure me that certainly that thing does happen. That's all.
And that the image of the cosmos was drawn. This goes back to about 100 years. We have amongst the Osage, you have these anthropologists working. They have these early petroglyphs, these early whelk shells. They have tattoos on some of their people. That cosmos vision was tattooed onto people's bodies. So it's also an anthropology, not just a cosmology. And you have the serpents, right? You have the Oxus Mundi, the tree, and then the thunderbirds. And it's like, I did not get that from some Christian prophecy book. That is from the Hero Hawk and Open Hand Art Institute catalog that happened in 2005 of unfurling the Mississippian Cosmos. The word Christ is deliberately not mentioned. But I'm like, I see a sacred tree at the center and a serpent that needs to be defeated. That's why I read Revelation 12. In Revelation 12, we get freaked out at that, and some people, because of the end times pre-trib charts, toss out the whole thing. Now that I've encountered native cosmology, I'm like, Revelation 12 is the only way to communicate it. That's the story of this country. Wow.
One more question.
I'm just going to grab the mic. Thank you so much. I have a similar question because... Hi, how's it going? You did a really good job noting when it was like, is this just a cross? When is this just a couple of intersecting lines? And I don't want to leave here being like, I heard this really great lecture, and every time I see two intersecting lines in any Indigenous art, it must be a cross, and get really excited about it. And it seemed like you let Indigenous artists pave the way and let them do that. And you had a ton of books flash in front of us.
Yeah.
Which one would you recommend? Like, this is a great starting point. Here's a great initial introduction into this world.
Thank you. That is an important question. Charleston's is great, but I think before that, I would recommend the great late Richard Twiss, One Church, Many Tribes. That book is, for me, was the deep introduction. And engaging in that, Cheryl Bair has a wonderful book on First Nations Christian ministry. She's from the Northwest in Canada, and she tells these harrowing stories. I love it. Maybe this is a great kind of conclusion, but she says, when I was on my res and the missionaries would come, they would say, ooh, we had to pray up before we came to your reservation. It's so dark here, the dark forces. And she said she heard them say that and said, we're so glad that my grandfather didn't hear them. He would have been so offended. So she grows up. She becomes a theologian herself. She's come to this campus many times. We've had powwows on this campus twice, okay? So she's come, and she told that story, and she said, you know what? I want to pray up when I go to your malls. Like, go Cheryl, right? And it's true. So that the way she communicates, and this is really important, NATES, the North American Institute for Indigenous Theological Studies, they do extraordinary work. We've taken students to those conferences, and they have met the descendants of the Christians who were kicked out of this area, of the Potawatomi. And that organization, they are fledgling, they need donations, they need help, and they are taken off because they want to tell their stories and not have me tell the stories. The only reason I can do this is because I've been in conversation with them. So them in particular, that's a really important place to go. NAIITS, an extraordinary, that's part of the Renaissance, and we've got to remember that. And a lot of them are evangelical Christians. Thank you.
Let me just recommend a couple of books for those that may be interested in history or politics, international relations. Charles Mann, 1491, 1493. Unbelievable mastery of pre-contact Americas, plural, and post-contact.
Yes, yes. And there's new biographies of Black Elk that came out, 2 in the last 5 years, that are totally blowing Neidhart's view out of the way, because they're going to tell the story of Nicholas Black Elk, who didn't die at Wounded Knee, but converted 400 people to Christ in his tribe and lived an extraordinary life.
Okay, thank you to both of you. Let's give one more round of applause. And we do have the books for sale at a discount, and we have a book signing. Christine Colon is here to sign her most recent book from University Press. So stick around, have some snacks, and buy some books. I didn't mean that commercially.